Christy, go right ahead. Take it away.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here with us this evening. I am Captain Christina Muncey, Christy Muncey. I have the pleasure of being the flight commander for the U.S. Air Force Band stationed at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling in Washington, D.C. And this evening, we're going to talk about score studies. So I'm going to share my screen with y'all, and I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you. And let's see, there we go. And basically, this is just a score study method that I have developed over the years, partially because I was taught several methods along the way. And what I was taught in school, sometimes I couldn't just fit it into what I was doing, my day-to-day administration, things that just popped up as things happened. So I started not really taking shortcuts, but rearranging how I did things, and really came up with a process that I found works well for me. And unfortunately, all the time, I will get scores dumped on my desk an hour before a rehearsal or a few days before a rehearsal. And so I've had a lot of opportunity to kind of hone this, and it works for me. Now, throughout all of this, there'll be things that you'll be doing specific to your needs, your ensemble, the kind of music that you're performing. The important thing is have a system that works for you, whatever that system is. So these are just some of the things that we're going to be talking about, and moving on into the purpose of score studies. So why do we study the score? First thing is we want to build an aural picture of the music. We want to know what this music sounds like in our head. We want to begin with the end in mind. It's something I know that educators hear all the time. But that helps us when we get on the box, when we get into rehearsal, so that we can have an idea of what might come along, what problems there might be, or, the band, the choir, the orchestra performs, they sing or they play, and you hear whatever the ensemble is in your head and go, wait a minute, that's not right. As opposed to getting on the box and going, well, I haven't seen this before, we're going to just see how it goes, and you're learning with your students. So first, we want to build an aural picture. Second, we want to figure out the composer's intent. What is the purpose of performing that music? Maybe it's an educational piece, or maybe it's something that the composer is trying to convey, an emotional thing or something technical, but what's the composer's intent? I mentioned before, we want to anticipate some problems, maybe come up with some solutions. You will know your ensemble and maybe what they are struggling with. If it's intonation, a particular technique, maybe you're teaching a new fingering or you're introducing a new concept. So this process can help you build that out ahead of time as well. And again, of course, this is always going to vary depending on the needs of your ensemble. So marking your score. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the tools that I use to mark my score, and I do recommend marking your score in some form or fashion. There are a lot of different systems out there, but sometimes people are afraid to mark their scores because they think, well, maybe someone else is going to use it down the road. Maybe those marks will help them. If you can, have a score that you can keep for your own personal library in case you come back to that piece, if your school has that kind of a budget, or if you're able to make a copy for yourself in some way. But some of the things that I always use when I'm marking a score is I actually have two different kinds of pencils. I have a dark pencil and I have a normal pencil. The dark pencil is for markings that I want to be able to see from a distance. A normal pencil, usually a mechanical pencil, those are small notations that I'm just making to myself that I don't want to pop out at me when I'm looking at the score while I'm conducting, but while I'm studying the score, defining a word or writing out a harmonic progression, something lighter that I can just see, I only need to see up close. I'll also have a ruler on hand. We'll talk about that a little later. I live and die by sticky notes, and I will actually keep small sticky notes. I have a little conducting bag, and I'll keep small sticky notes in there for a lot of reasons. One of them is on a score like this. I was actually working on a score with one of my bands, and the score I was rehearsing from that day was not the final score. There was another edit that was coming. I knew it was coming, but I didn't want to walk into rehearsal not having marked anything on there. And I knew once I got the new score, I wasn't going to have a whole lot of time either. So I said, all right, I'm going to make these notes on my stickies so that I can just take them from one score to the next. And it ended up saving me a lot of time in the long run. I'll also use sticky notes to mark things in the score when I'm prepping rehearsal ahead of time. I'll use them as tabs at the top of the score so it's easy for me to find where I am on the page. Among other things, again, I live and die by sticky notes. I'll also have a pen on hand in case there are any permanent marks I want to make, although I don't make many permanent marks, but sometimes you find a wrong note and you want to mark that in your score, make sure it doesn't get erased. And then I also have a highlighter. Some people use a lot of highlighters. I just have one on hand, and I only use it, again, for something that I know I want to be permanent and I really want to stand out. And in this example, score in C. And I point that out because I all the time will get a score. If it's not a transposed score, I'll be going through it and I'll start through the audiation process and I'll go, wait a minute, something's not right here. Flip back to the beginning and go, oh, it's because the score's in C. I was doing the transposition. So I'll always mark that in highlighter so it stands out at me, but that's pretty much all I use it for. But I keep one on hand just in case. And then finally, I use a fingertip moisturizer. A lot of times when I'm conducting, I'm one of those where I will lick my finger and turn every single page. I actually have some of this stuff on my fingers right now so that I can turn the pages of my notes because I just have a hard time turning pages. So I keep some of that stuff on hand all the time whenever I'm studying my scores, whether I'm at work, whether I'm at home, on the road, I always have these things. So whatever your tools are, have a little score study bag that you can keep with you, a little pencil bag. It helps out quite a bit. So when I first started learning how to conduct, when I was an undergraduate conducting class, I was told, go study your score, prepare it, come back, and we're going to do X, Y, Z. In a lot of undergraduate conducting classes, there's a lot of focus on the mechanics of conducting, the down, in, out, up, cues, crescendos, decrescendos, left-hand independence, all of those sorts of things. And so sometimes score study is talked about a little bit, but not in depth. And so when I was told to go forth and prep my score, this is what I ended up with. And now I look at it and all I see is pink and green with a little bit of orange. And I don't see the notes on the page at all. And it's such a distraction for me. So I eventually went through a couple of conducting degree programs and learned another method of, actually I learned several others. And at one point I was in a summer conducting program where there were 3 different styles of score marking. And so this page is actually all 3 score marking systems at once. And again, I look at it now and it's a mess. I see blue and red and some highlighter and not much else. It's when I glance at it quickly, I'm not getting a lot off the page to tell me what's important, what do I need to be conducting. Then when I got through to my DMA, pardon, I thought I had one more slide there. Sorry, let me back up. So let's actually, we'll talk about the 7 trips through the score. This is one of the methods of score study that I learned during my master's program. And I'm only pointing this out because as I have developed my new study method, it's based on these 7 trips through the score. So very quickly, each trip is something that you focus on individually and you go front to back in the score. So on that first trip, you're looking just at your instrumentation, which a lot of times is easy, but if you have a multi-movement work, maybe the winds aren't playing in a particular movement if you're doing an orchestral piece, or if you're working through a choral piece, it's just men's chorus, but how many different parts there are. So that's one whole trip. The next trip, tempo. Trip after that, form. And the idea behind it is each additional trip cements the music a little further in your brain and you're focusing on one thing with the goal of, by the time you get down to the 7th trip, the dynamics at the end, which includes some color work, you learn the piece of music. Now, there are other trips you have to consider. Articulation, special effects, if you have a choral group, diction, cutoffs, all of those things. So every consideration you have is one particular trip. And again, it's the idea of cementing the music in your brain with each trip. So as a dutiful student, I did all of that and I ended up with much neater looking scores. So this is one of my scores under the 7 trips method. And so I have a better idea of what it is on the page that I need to be paying attention to, but I would still get to the end of my score study, spending hours and hours making my scores look great, trying to learn the music, and not have a great idea of what the music sounded like in my head. So progressed into my DMA, and in that score study method, it's all about singing the lines individually, which I had heard from some other conducting teachers along the way, but that conducting professor didn't advocate marking much at all. So on that one, once I got done singing through all of the lines, I had a really good idea of what the music was supposed to sound like, but then having a hard time, all right, I need to have a few markings on the page so that when I'm rushing from a staff meeting into rehearsal, and I'm like, okay, oh yeah, that's right, take a quick glance at the music and I can remember what it is. So that method of marking looked more like this, where it's more of a minimal marking system, and it really only shows me the information that I absolutely need to have, glance down at the page quickly, and then I can look back up at my ensemble. So the idea behind these trips revisited, and this is when I have little to no time, is getting as much information from the page on my head as possible while making sure I mark as little as I need to at a time to get through a rehearsal. Because as I mentioned before, sometimes I get a score on my desk and an hour later I have to run a rehearsal, which happens frequently for me. We have several conductors in our band, and I tend to be the one when everyone else is busy. They're like, oh, here, can you cover this for me? Like, yeah, got it, not a problem. So this is based on the 7 trips. And I do want to preface this by saying that when I have time to really spend with a score, I actually do most of this backwards. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But again, the idea behind this is when you're short on time, what is the minimum that you need to look at to get through a rehearsal so that you are efficient and effective? So I kind of combine my first and second trips together. One of the first things I do, and I mentioned this already, is I will check to see if the score is transposed or in C. Now, you might work with a kind of ensemble where you're only ever in a C score, which is great. So that's one thing that you don't even have to worry about. You can skip that and move right on. But if you're in an ensemble where you have, it might be a C transposition or sorry, a transposed score or a C score, something important to help you out, because I've been caught before being on the podium and someone asks me a question and I read the score wrong and they're like, that's not even close. I'm like, okay, yeah, nope, you're right. I transposed when I shouldn't have. So always check that. And then, and this is if you have just 5 minutes before rehearsal and the music just came in the door, flip through and just like you're kind of flipping through every single page of a book, and make note of big moments, roadmaps. Are there repeats? Are there DSs or a coda? Tempo changes, meter changes, speed changes, so sudden changes as well as an accelerando, retardando. And then if I have absolutely no other time other than that, the only thing that I will mark on my score on that very first trip are staff breaks. And the reason why is sometimes composers or publishers will take out staffs that are not needed on larger scores, or if you're working from a string orchestra or a choral score, they can fit multiple systems on a page. And I have multiple times on a score that I'm not real familiar with thought one page was an entire system and skipped right to the next page. And then I'm lost in the music. I don't know what's going on. I have to stop rehearsal and reorient myself. And that's just not efficient. So I will staff breaks whenever I can, if I need to. And if that is all I have time for, at the very least, I can make it through one rehearsal knowing some basic information. Now you'll see some other marks on these examples that I'm giving you, because these are scores that I have completely gone through and marked up. But they also, again, these are just for the staff breaks. So that's the first trip. If that's all I have time for, I can usually accomplish that in 10, 15 minutes or so, depending on the length and complexity of the piece. Now, if I have time before rehearsal, I will take a second trip through the score. And as time allows, then I will start marking the following things. First will be tempo with metronome markings as well as tempo changes. So if you have a tempo marking and it's just an expression marking like molto adagio or espressivo, go ahead and assign a metronome marking to it. And the reason why is because that way when you come back to it later, you've already rehearsed the piece maybe once or twice with your ensemble, you come back to it to spend more time on score study or rehearsal, you have a consistent metronome marking. Also, for further steps in this method, as soon as you have that metronome marking set, turn on your metronome and then it's on clicking every time you open that score so that you're learning the music at the proper tempo. Let's see. So yeah, and if it's not easy to see, write it even bigger. So on the second example, there's a metronome marking there, but the way I mark my tempos, I put that little box around it. And so when I look at a page very quickly, I can see that that's a tempo and I don't have to get down and look close and think too hard about it. So that's something that for me helps be very efficient right off the bat. Also, if there's a tempo change on the next page, I will mark it in the margin. And even if the margins are very, very small, I'll still mark them because if I'm moving quickly through something, I don't want to miss a tempo marking on a page turn, have to stop and restart because then we're just losing time. And that is the one thing we have so precious little of. Speed up, slow down to your accelerando, retardandos. This is one of the first times I'll use my ruler. I'll draw a line backwards for retardandos and lines forward for accelerando. And then I'll even go a little bit further. The ones that are in parentheses are like poco retardando, just a little bit. Double lines are like the retardando molto, or if it's a really fast accelerando, it'll be double lines pointing forward. And again, these are just things that I can quickly glance at the page, see the information that I need, and then I can focus on what I'm hearing, what the ensemble's giving back to me. Then after that, and again, these are each as I have time, and if I run out of time, I have to go to rehearsal or do something else, then I will pick it back up where I left off. So let's say I get a brand new score, I've marked my staff breaks and I've marked my tempos, and then I have to go to rehearsal. Next time I pick up the score, I'll mark my meters. And I'll do it in a visual fashion because we tend to see symbols easier than we see numbers or words. And so I have this visual system that looks like the pattern if it's a normal 2-4-4-4 pattern, or if it's an asymmetrical pattern system, it looks like the notes, how they are barred together. And so it's easy for me to take a look at the page quickly and process the meters. So I'm not focusing on note for note. I'm thinking, okay, I've learned this music. This is how I'm going to conduct it. Sometimes you have to get a little bit creative with the meter markings. This is a page out of Stravinsky's Octet, which the opening section is a complicated one to conduct. And so I kind of combined a couple of different systems. But once you set something up, whatever works for you, you can look at the page, quickly get the information, and then you're not buried in what's in the paper. You can pay more attention to the ensemble and the information that they're giving you. Sometimes when I will go do a quick trip through a score, I'll just write the meters up at the top. But in the second example, especially in that first measure, what I'm looking at on the page, there's nobody playing. What I'm looking at is down further in the staff. And so I will actually go back sometimes and rewrite the meters in near where the music that I will be looking at is, so I can focus on both simultaneously. But that I would do on a subsequent trip. I wouldn't do that if I'm super short on time. So once I have those things worked in, I'll make sure that my roadmap is in, and that includes fermatas. Again, I will write fermatas bigger and above the staff. Sometimes they get buried that it's hard to see. And then same thing with DSs, codas, I'll write them out nice and big. Every now and again, I'll also put repeat signs above the staff as well, if they're hard to see in the page itself, which sometimes happens. Then I will add in rehearsal letters and numbers. Sometimes they exist and that's great and you can see them fine, but like in this example, that measure 63, even on the full size score, it's impossible to see from the box. And so I'll take the time to write it bigger. And if it's a circle, I'll write whatever it is on the page, that's how I will mirror it as I write it. But that'll just help me save time when I'm rehearsing the ensemble. Also, every now and again, they won't put in rehearsal markings. And sometimes they'll just be the measure numbers at the end of the line, which may or may not be a logical place for you to start your ensemble. And, you know, sometimes you start in the middle of a phrase and you're not going to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So I will write in rehearsal numbers or rehearsal letters as needed if the publisher doesn't already provide them. So those are the first two trips. Usually if I'm short on time, I get a score really late in the rehearsal process, I can get through rehearsals with at least that basic amount of information and catch a little bit more along the way. Again, this is not ideal. This is just when we're short on time. From there, I will tab the movements. And what that means is I will have those little colorful tabs that you can get at any office supply store. And for a piece like a Dover score where you have multiple pieces, each piece is its own color so that it's easy for me to tell which is Symphony 1 or 4, 5, 6, that sort of thing. And if I'm doing something that's more complicated like a musical or an opera, then each act will be its own color. And again, this is all about efficiency in rehearsal so that when you're saying, all right, we're going to start at movement 2, you can just flip to movement 2. You're not having to flip through a bunch of pages or figure out what page that particular movement starts on. Luckily, that's a really quick trip, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Now is when things start to take a little bit more time. The next thing that I will do is mark the phrases. And at this point, if I've already rehearsed the piece a time or two, I probably know where those phrase markings are already. And this is again where my ruler will come in handy, and I will just lay it lengthwise against the page and use my dark pencil and draw a big old line down the middle of the page, all the way from top to bottom. Some people will mark their phrases at the top. What I found for me is that if I mark the phrase at the top, then my eyes tend to stay at the top of the page. And if I'm looking at the percussion or one of the low brass, I lose track of where the phrases are. And I mark the phrases so that it helps me understand where I am in the music, as well as if I'm, say, performing the piece and we're in concert, I can look down at the page very quickly, remind myself of what the music is, and then look up and interact with the ensemble better. So again, it's all about that efficiency piece, being able to be effective as well on the podium. Now, I will tend to keep my phrases in groups of 2, 3, or 4. You can have 1 measure phrases, happens. You can have 5, 6, 7 measure phrases, also happens. What I found, again, this is for me, is when I have anything larger than a 4-bar phrase, because I'm used to seeing nothing longer than a 4-bar phrase, I will shrink it down into those 4 measures. So in this particular Mozart example, that 5-bar phrase on the top system kept tripping me up because I would look at it and it's also kind of squished together. And I kept thinking, man, it's 4 bars. And then I'd start cueing things wrong. And so that's why I put that 5 in front of it. And if I ever go back and conduct this piece again, I might even rebar it into a 3+2, just so that when I look at it and then I'm looking back up at the ensemble and cueing them, I might have a better remembrance of, okay, this is a 3+2, which is actually a 5. But generally anything smaller than 2, if you have a bunch of 1-bar phrases, it can get choppy on the page. But sometimes the music calls for it. Anything longer than 4, sometimes you don't pick up that it's a longer phrase. But maybe for you, it works that way. Through this trip, I'll also translate unfamiliar words. Now, one thing, and I'm pointing out this book in particular because there are many ways that you can go and find foreign words and have them translated. I love this book. I discovered this book during my master's, and I actually have 2 copies. I keep one at work and I keep one at home. Most of the time when I'm working on band scores, I know the words already. If I'm working on usually an orchestral score, every now and again, I'll have some words that I'm unfamiliar with. Although from time to time, I will have band scores that'll come up with words that I'm not familiar with. And so I'll define them, because maybe something like this one, it's, and I wrote it down, it's cantando molto con calore. So cantando, that makes sense, it's cantabile. Calore, like, okay, color, maybe? The actual definition is with warmth, fervent, and impetuous, which I think changes a little bit how you would approach the music and maybe how you want your ensemble to perform it. So that's where I take my regular pencil. I don't want it necessarily jumping out at me on the page when I'm conducting, but going through and defining all of those words. And then this is just a fun word, mormondo, murmuring, whispering, rustling. Again, that one I kind of figured out, but when I actually looked up the definition, it helped me have a better idea of how I wanted the music to sound, so that when I was giving feedback to my bassoons and euphonium players, I could say, this is the kind of sound I'm looking for, and help them out with that. So defining any unfamiliar words is incredibly helpful. And then also through this phase and this trip, a lot of times you can do this in conjunction with marking the phrases. This is where I will start to hear the music in my head and actually thinking to myself, all right, what do the flutes sound like? And pause and hear the flutes in my head. What do the clarinets sound like? And hear that timbre, hear, maybe it's an upper register, and so there's some of that strident tone to a particular instrument, or it's a lower register on an instrument that has a lot of warmth to it. And this is where I start to build what I call the band in my head, or if I'm in front of an orchestra or choir, whatever ensemble it is, it's the sound of what I want in my head, so that when I get on the box, I can say, all right, this is the sound we're looking for. This is what you're giving me. Let's figure out where the discrepancy is and get that changed. 3 trips so far, and a lot of times I'll combine multiple things into a single trip. Like you can mark phrases and audiate at the same time. Maybe while you're doing that, you stumble across an unfamiliar word, you translate it quickly. So it's all about just kind of how can you put this all in together to be as efficient as possible. So once that's done, I will mark important moments. So these are your cues. And the way I mark cues is I just use a left parenthesis. I don't use highlighters or colors, because again, for me, that distracts from the music itself. I actually lose the notes on the page when I start using colors. However, maybe that works for you. So whatever works for you, please by all means do it. And then I also have a shorthand for each instrument so that I can mark it quickly. So each instrument I have distilled down to 2 or 3 letters, so that I can easily tell, oh, that's an alto saxophone, that's a soprano saxophone, English horn. And it works pretty well even when working with a full orchestra score with choir. Sometimes, if you have your soprano saxophone along with your soprano voices, maybe that might create some confusion, but they're in different places in the score, so hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. And then I'll also mark it, kind of like with the tempos, if there is a cue of something important happening on the next page, I'll mark it in the margin on the page before, just so that when I glance down at the page and get that information, I'm like, oh, I have a trumpet that I have to cue on the next page. For percussion, I use a hybrid of writing symbols and sometimes some words. We see symbols easier than we see words. I mentioned that earlier with the meter marking. And so with some of the instruments that for me are easy to draw, because I have no visual artistic skills whatsoever, timpani, cymbals, triangle, those sorts of things are really easy for me to sketch out. So I will write those visually, and so it's easy for me to see that. If it's something that I can't draw real well, like a snare drum, tried that, doesn't work. I tried drawing out a tambourine as well, that also doesn't work. So some of those for the percussion instruments, I usually have to use 4 letters just because of the complexity of the words. But don't forget to mark your percussion instruments as well for whatever you need. Symbols for words, I'm all about the symbols. If you have a score and it's written out that you have a crescendo or a decrescendo, again, for me, I will lose the musical meaning in the words sometimes. And on this example, the crescendo are kind of buried in the various systems. So I actually went ahead and penciled in these hairpins. And it's a little, be careful not to use anything that's going to distract or cover up the notes themselves so that you can still see the music. But on this, after having gone through this piece a couple times, because I kept focusing on things that I felt, well, let me rephrase that. I felt I needed to focus more on the dynamic contrast there. And so that's why I chose to make those markings, although I didn't make them right away. It was a choice that I did later on. So when you can write symbols for words, it'll be helpful for sure. So we're moving down. You've probably been through a couple rehearsals at this point, and you're just solidifying your score study. And this is where I will start to actually sing the individual parts, one line at a time. And usually with my schedule, this is where I just flat start running out of time if I haven't gotten to it already. Again, if I have time, I reverse this process. But the point of singing through it is so that you have in your head the pitch, the style, the articulation, everything that you want your ensemble to play. If you're like me, and maybe I'm not a singer by trade, I started my musical life as a flute player. So I'll sit at a piano and help myself find notes, but I won't actually piano read the score, and I'll talk more a little about that in just a few minutes. But I'll sing it because I can get my voice to emulate better what I want the instruments to do than I can on the piano, because my piano skills are unfortunately not the best. Now, if I don't have a ton of time and I can't sing every single individual part, I'll start with the melody. At the very least, make sure I've got the melody in my head. Make sure I've got my counter melody in my head. And then I will also pay special attention to percussion so that I can give them good feedback as well as everyone else. As a flute player, I've spent a lot of time trying to make sure I speak fluent percussion so that they're getting as much benefit as the other instruments that I'm more familiar with. This is also going through and singing all the parts is also helpful in finding errors in the score. And editors do a great job, composers do great jobs, publishers do great jobs, but we're all human. Sometimes errors find their way into the score, into the parts. And on this one, if you look about 3/4 of the way down the page, that second, third trumpet part, it's written as an F natural and it needs to be an F sharp, and it's wrong in the score and in the parts. And the interesting thing is that in this particular piece, there's another error interestingly not in the score, it's only in the parts. So finding those errors, and especially if you can catch them ahead of time before the rehearsal starts, that's going to save you time. So you're not thinking that your students are playing a wrong note and trying to fix something that actually they're doing correctly. So singing the individual parts helps you find some of those errors ahead of time. Trip 6, this is where if I haven't already, I will actually practice and just practice the mechanics of conducting. That's something that I think we spend so much time encouraging our students to do, practicing their instruments, but we as conductors don't often have that time. And so as I'm going through, and again, sometimes I'll combine some of these together. If I'm going through and I'm marking my phrases, I'll practice conducting through a tricky meter, or maybe I'm working through a transition. How fast, how slow do I want the accelerando or retardando to go? If I get to a fermata, what am I going to do after it? We learned different ways to get out of fermata in conducting class. If it's not marked on the score, do I want to press through it? Do I want to release and go? Are we going to pause after? And then I have to practice that. If I don't practice it and I get up on the box, I might not do it the same way every time, which is going to cause confusion, and that's going to break down the efficiency of the rehearsal. So practice your conducting whenever you can. And then if you haven't already, research the piece and composer. Why was it written? Who was it written for? Harmonic analysis, you might have done this already in a previous trip. Same thing with the formal analysis. At this point, you probably have a pretty darn good idea of what the form is, or if you're doing something like a march, you probably knew what the form is going into it. And then any specific needs for your ensemble. Maybe you need to make an intonation chart. Maybe, again, you're working on a new fingering, working on vibrato, a particular musical concept, you turn it into an etude. There's a technique that you need to work on, whatever specifics for your ensemble that you can do at this point. So I will often get asked when to use recordings. And I will often use recordings very early on in my programming process to get an idea of, especially if I don't have a score to a piece, take a listen to it. Do I want to hear this or not? After that, I will not listen to a recording because I want to make sure that I'm getting the music from the page, not from what I'm hearing, because sometimes I will have a different idea of how a piece will go. I will read an articulation differently. I will think this staccato needs to be a little different from how they performed it. Or sometimes errors just get into recordings because live music, even recorded music, sometimes errors happen. And so I don't want to learn something wrong. But if there's a piece that I'm working on that has particularly tricky transitions, especially, sometimes I will use, once I've learned a score, sometimes I will use a recording as a part of my practice, my actual conducting practice. Because if you get up in front of your box and you're not sure how to get through a transition or how you want to conduct a particular meter, and you're working that out with your ensemble, depending on the level of your ensemble, it might confuse them, or it might just be eating up time that you need to be working on something else. So as much of that as you can work out ahead of time, it's important to do so. Now, of course, sometimes we don't have that time. That's why we're kind of talking about score study trips when we don't have any time. But that's when I will use a recording, because that will save a little bit of time in rehearsal, but only after I have built an oral picture of the piece for myself. So I'm not learning things, if someone played a wrong note somewhere or played a wrong articulation. Now, I said I would talk a little bit about playing the score at the piano. If you are an accomplished piano player, then this is something that could be very beneficial to you. I am not. I can play the piano as we all can, but I'm definitely not what I would call accomplished. And I find more value and I learn the music better when I sing through the parts myself as opposed to play them at the piano. I also, because my piano skills aren't great, I can do a better job of getting the color, the emotion, the articulation that I hear in my head when I'm singing than I can on the piano. If you have that ability, that capability on piano to read your score, then that is something that can probably help you through a lot of these processes very quickly, building that oral picture of the music. But if not, if it's something where you can't get the articulations quite right, or you can't really get the color of the different instruments, then singing it will probably be a better way to go for you. But both are definitely options. So in an ideal world, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I would actually start at the end. I would start by researching the composer and the intent. I would start by singing through the lines individually, one at a time, not just melody, counter melody, and maybe bass and percussion, but each individual line. And then I would go through, once I've seen each line, I will hear, say, the flutes together, clarinets together, and then woodwinds together, brass together, and then the whole band. But it takes so much time to be able to do that. So if I can start well in advance, that's how I like to start. That's how I like to be able to learn a piece, so that by the time I get done, I sing through the parts, I mark my phrases, I'll mark my cues, I'll mark the meters and all the tempo changes, all of those things. I'll have the piece hopefully mostly memorized before I get on the box, so that I can be as efficient and effective as possible. But the reality of the situation is that I generally don't have that much time, which is why I've come across this particular method to figure out what is the bare minimum that I need to get on the box and have an efficient and effective rehearsal. So just a bit of a recap. We'll have some time for questions if you'll have them in a couple of minutes. But we talked about, why do we study the score? And the bottom line is figure out what you need to do for your ensemble. My goal when I score study is to be prepared for an efficient and effective rehearsal. Maybe your goal is you need to make sure you know where all the new fingerings are, or you need to know where the intonation issues are going to be, or where diction is going to come into play. Marking your score, definitely make sure that you do it, whatever you need. If you like highlighters and colored pencils, if it's effective for you, go for it. If you are like me and those colors distract you from the music, find something that allows you to focus on just what you need to be able to get through your rehearsal. And then, of course, went through the 7 trips and the method that I'm using these days. So that is the basics of it, the little bit that I have right now. So what I'm curious about now, I'll leave this contact information up. Please, by all means, if ever you have questions or comments or really anything, that's my cell phone number and my personal email address, as well as my work email. Feel free to reach out to me, ask questions. I taught high school for a number of years. I taught some college. And one of the things I love about my job now is being able to assist educators, because what you do is so incredibly important. The way you teach music to children, interact with children, help them to grow, it's just incredible. And so the more I can assist you, please let me know how. But if y'all have any questions at this time, I'd love to answer them for you.
So go ahead. If anyone does have questions, you can either type them in the chat, or if you want to talk, down at the bottom of the screen, if you scroll your button there, there's a little microphone and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Anyway, we'll take them. Guess you always have to ask or add a little time there for
of course.
Typing.
So if someone's typing a question or thinking of a question I do get from time to time is, how do you hear the different instruments in your head? How do you know what a flute sounds like? How do you know what a bassoon sounds like? And the first time I got this question was from a college student. And my answer to him was, listen to a great deal of music. And if there's an instrument that you struggle to hear, or a voice part that you struggle to hear, maybe because you play a soprano instrument and you have a harder time with bass instruments or vice versa, then listen to solos of that particular instrument. Listen to sonatas of that instrument. When you listen to music on the radio or just in your own private listening, try to pick out that particular voice, so that when you get to that audition part of your score study, you can hear clearly in your head what a trumpet sounds like, and really for the bonus points is B flat trumpet versus C trumpet, or even a D trumpet if you're getting into some of those orchestral pieces, or an A clarinet versus a B flat clarinet. What are those subtle differences, so that again you can be more effective in giving feedback to your ensemble.
Christy, I have a question for you.
Yes.
And this might affect some other people, and I know sometimes I, myself approach things differently. Just being in different worlds, I know sometimes you mentioned like opera and musical theater, but also looking at, the performance world as opposed. We're all teachers at some point when we're on the podium, obviously. But sometimes when we walk into a rehearsal, sometimes, we've got other objectives as well as making music as opposed to teaching. Do you, from your time doing that and also what you're doing now, do you approach things differently when you're prepping for rehearsals in also kind of that classroom setting-esque as well for anybody out there too?
That's a great question. And that goes back to, before you even open the score, what is the purpose for your score study? What is your primary objective? And for me right now, when I'm working with my band in DC, my objective is the performance. But I also have the opportunity to work with student groups. And so I have to figure out what is my new objective. When I was teaching myself, sometimes that objective would be, all right, we're working on a particular technique or style of music. And so when I would do my score study, I would focus on making sure I knew what that was, where it was in the music, and just setting up in my head ahead of time how I wanted to approach that. And then, of course, how it fit into the greater piece of music. So yeah, it's just having that goal in mind, whatever that objective is. And sometimes it's not a performance. Sometimes you pull out a piece and all you're doing is reading it down. And I do that with my band as well. Every now and again, we will get scores that come our way that we will read for any number of reasons. Sometimes we're doing just some sight reading because we're going to need to figure out, do we want to do this piece or not? Sometimes we get a composer who says, hey, can you put together a scratch recording for me? And so knowing what that end game is, I will approach the scores differently, even with my band right now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious that, how, from your time doing it to what you're doing now, obviously the objective is always the important goal. But just to see if you approach it any which way. But I mean, it makes total sense.
Well, and I did kind of, I guess to follow up on that, I do approach the score differently now than I did when I was teaching, but more so in that I'm more efficient with my time, mainly because I've had more time to think about, well, shoot, I need to get this done and I need to make sure I don't make a fool of myself on the box, my ensemble. And so I think the way I approach things differently now is as a product of having taught. And I just remember when I was teaching high school and even college, where I would pick up a score and go to rehearsal and think, man, I have no idea what I'm doing today. I've got to figure out a better way.
Sure. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a good question.
Anyone else? Nothing's coming on the chat box. It was very thorough.
Oh, thank you. Well, and if something else comes up, if you think of a question along the way, or you want to challenge me on something and you want to do it in a different forum, because everyone has a different method of score study, and sometimes people are very passionate about it. What I would leave you with is, please reach out to me with any questions that you have, any way that I can be of assistance to you and your students. And whatever method works for you, figure out what it is that you need to be effective for your students, for your ensembles, and run with it. But definitely try to find those times to look at your score, because the more you have that music in your head, the more you'll be able to help your students. And just thank you all so much for everything that you do. I love all the work. Music educators are the unsung heroes in the world, and I just appreciate all of your hard work.
Thank you so much, Christy.
Yes, thank you. That was great. That's a lot of information to take in. It was really good.
Yeah, that might be the other thing. Excellent.